Alice and her 3-year-old son, Tommy, went to the grocery store like they did every Saturday morning. It had become a routine she cherished. Tommy, in his little cart seat, chattering away, while Alice worked through her list. The store was always busy, but she had it down to a science. Eggs, milk, bread, vegetables, snacks for Tommy. They were always out of the door in under 30 minutes. That particular Saturday had been no different. Tommy had insisted on bringing his favorite stuffed bunny. Mr. Flop and Alice had given in, knowing how much her son adored it. As they moved through the aisles, Tommy clutched the bunny, his wide eyes scanning the shelves. He pointed to things he recognized, asking Alice for cereal, cookies, and fruit, and she occasionally indulged him. It wasn't until they reached the frozen foods aisle that things changed. Alice bent down to grab a bag of peas from the lower shelf. When she straightened up, her heart stopped. The cart was empty. Tommy was gone. Her stomach clenched as the cold air from the freezer hit her face. She spun around, scanning the aisle. No Tommy. The small, everyday hum of the store suddenly became deafening children laughing, carts rattling, the beeping of the checkout counters. Alice's hands began to shake. How could he have just disappeared? Tommy. Her voice cracked as she called his name, louder than she had intended. She moved down the aisle, peering around displays, her breath coming faster and faster. It had only been a few seconds, maybe a minute, but her mind was already spiraling. What if someone had taken him? Alice's heart pounded in her chest as she rushed to the end of the aisle, her eyes darting around, searching for any sign of her son. Panic clawed at her throat. She ran past other shoppers, calling his name more urgently now. Then she saw him. Tommy was standing at the end of the candy aisle, looking up at the rows of brightly colored sweets. Mr. Flop dangled from his small hand. Relief washed over Alice, so intense that her knees nearly gave out. She rushed toward him, scooping him up into her arms, hugging him tightly. "Tommy," she gasped, her voice trembling. "Don't you ever wander off like that again." Tommy blinked up at her, wide-eyed but unbothered. He simply nodded, as if he hadn't just given his mother the worst scare of her life. Alice tried to compose herself, but something felt off. The relief of finding Tommy wasn't enough to shake the feeling that something was wrong. As she carried him back to the cart, she glanced at his face. His expression was blank. Not his usual cheerful, curious self, just blank. She chalked it up to the scare. They finished their shopping in silence, Alice's hands trembling as she loaded the groceries into the cart. Tommy sat quietly, not even asking for candy, as they passed the colorful displays. By the time they reached the car, Alice was exhausted. She buckled Tommy into his car seat, and as she drove home, she kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror. He was staring out the window, clutching Mr. Flop tightly, his face still expressionless. That night, as Alice put Tommy to bed, she couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her. He hadn't said much during dinner, and when she asked if he was feeling okay, he only nodded and went back to playing with his food. Alice kissed him goodnight, tucking Mr. Flop under his arm, and watched as he closed his eyes and fell asleep almost immediately. But even in sleep, something about him seemed different. In the days that followed, Alice noticed more changes. Tommy, who had always been a bundle of energy, now seemed quieter, more reserved. He no longer played with his toys the same way. Instead of racing his toy cars across the floor, he just lined them up in neat, perfect rows. He spent hours doing this, silently, his face still devoid of expression. His laughter, once a constant soundtrack in their home, had vanished. Alice grew increasingly disturbed. Every day, she felt a creeping dread gnawing at her, an unease she couldn't explain. Tommy was physically fine, she told herself, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. Then there were the questions. Simple things: what he wanted for lunch, if he wanted to go to the park, if he wanted to watch his favorite show, were met with silence or a slow nod. The vibrant, chatty little boy, she knew, had been replaced by someone different. Alice tried to talk to her husband Mark about it, but he shrugged it off. He's probably just going through a phase, Mark said, brushing her concerns aside. Kids change all the time. He'll snap out of it. But Alice wasn't so sure. One evening, about a week after the incident at the grocery store, Alice was cleaning up the kitchen while Tommy played in the living room. She could hear the sound of his toys clattering as he lined them up in his usual methodical way. But something made her stop mid-scrub. It was too quiet. No murmurs of play, no hum of Tommy's usual imaginative games, just silence. She stepped into the living room and froze. Tommy was sitting on the floor, staring at Mr. Flop, holding the bunny at arm's length as if examining it. His face was completely blank, and his eyes, those eyes Alice knew so well, seemed empty. "Tommy," she called softly, her voice shaking. He didn't respond. He didn't even blink. Alice's heart raced as she approached him, kneeling down beside him. "Tommy, sweetie, what are you doing?" Finally, he looked at her, but it was like looking into the eyes of a stranger. The warmth, the light, everything that made Tommy was gone. Alice's skin prickled with fear. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, his voice monotone, like he was speaking from a script. "Thinking about what?" Alice asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "About Mr. Flop," Tommy replied, still staring at the stuffed bunny. "He's not mine anymore." Alice's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, honey? Of course he's yours. You've had him since you were born." Tommy shook his head, his gaze never leaving the toy. "No, he doesn't belong to me now." Alice's hand shook as she reached for the bunny. "Tommy, what are you talking about?" But before she could grab it, Tommy stood up abruptly, his movements jerky, unnatural. He turned away from her, walking toward his bedroom without another word. Alice sat there, stunned, clutching Mr. Flop in her hands. The soft fabric felt wrong under her fingers, as if it had absorbed the same unsettling energy that now radiated from her son. She didn't know what to do. Every instinct in her body screamed that something was horribly wrong, but she couldn't make sense of it. It had been 1 minute. 1 minute where Tommy had disappeared. But somehow, in that brief span of time, something had changed. Not just in Tommy, but in the very air around them. Days turned into weeks, and Tommy's behavior grew stranger. He still played with his toys, but now it was more like a ritual, each car an action figure placed with obsessive precision. He stopped asking for his favorite foods, instead accepting whatever was given to him without question. He no longer laughed or cried, his emotions seemingly extinguished. Alice tried to get him to talk, to play like he used to, but nothing worked. And the worst part was the feeling that grew inside her, an overwhelming sense of dread that something far more sinister was at play. She began to avoid looking into his eyes. There was something in them now, something dark and unfamiliar. One night, as Alice lay in bed next to Mark, her mind racing, she heard a sound coming from Tommy's room. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of whispering. She bolted upright, her heart pounding. She crept down the hall and pushed open Tommy's door. He was sitting on the floor, in the dark, whispering softly to Mr. Flop. "Tommy," she whispered, her voice shaking. He didn't turn around. He just kept whispering to the bunny, his voice too low for her to understand. She stepped closer, her skin crawling with fear. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Tommy turned, then, slowly, and looked at her with those blank, empty eyes. "I'm just telling him," he said, his voice flat. "He's not mine anymore." Alice backed away, her breath catching in her throat. She turned and fled the room, her heart racing. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure. The boy sitting in that room wasn't Tommy, not anymore.